I am a technology at Rocket Mortgage, the nation's largest mortgage company now. A little bit about me. I um, I run events similar to this, like Desert Code Camp, and I attend a lot of conferences throughout the U.S. and internationally. You can reach out to me at Joe Guadagno or on my website at jjg.me/aboutjjg. You'll notice a lot of the links in the slide all start with jjg.me/6 for .NET 6. And then if you want to write down any links, you only have to write down the latter portion. So let's get started. Our agenda today, we are going to talk about C#10. We're then going to talk about some changes in ASP.NET and then walk into Maui. Oh wait, we're not going to walk into Maui because Maui wasn't actually released as part of .NET 6 because of some challenges. So instead, we're going to talk about some Windows forms and improvements, then move on to some performance improvements that were made, talk about some new APIs that were introduced, and then some other cool features of .NET 6. But before we go into that, let's talk about the vision of .NET in general. So we have, or Microsoft has what they call the unified platform. That is their approach to how we want to deliver software, or at least how they want us to deliver software in the future. And the unified platform kind of looks like this. .NET 6 is the second part of this unification strategy that started with .NET 5. So the idea is to have you be able to develop using one platform for either Azure, ASP.NET, Maui, Unity, IoT devices, as well as AI. And .NET is kind of sitting underneath all of them that allows you to build these applications. So you're probably wondering, how do you get started with .NET 6? Easiest way right now is to just target it. Now within your csproj file or bbproj files, you can set the target framework to .NET 6. So it would be NET 6.0. And that allows your application to target .NET 6. If you're using Visual Studio or JetBrains Writer, you can just choose the properties and change the target framework for your app. Introduced with .NET 6 are also some other what are called monikers. These are basically a way for you to target a specific version of the framework or a specific version of SDKs. There are 5 additional ones added outside of the .NET 6. There's Android, iOS, Mac Catalyst, tvOS, as well as Windows. Now, these SDKs or these monikers are used when you want to kind of use a particular version of the framework. So let's say there's something specific or feature specific for Android that you want to use that's not available in, let's say, iOS or Windows. You can add that moniker to it, and then with the conditional define statements like the pound if, you can target Android specific functionality. Right now, some of that is limited. The reason why there's an iOS, Mac, and tvOS is because they all have different SDKs and different features. But if you're looking for the broadest set of reach, you're going to want to take care of just using .NET 6.0. Let's take a look at the first set of things that were changed. .NET 6 introduced C#10, and one of the first features or most common features that everyone talks about is the global using statements in code. So what this does for you is allows you to reference a particular using statement globally throughout your application. So a lot of times you're doing system.console or system.console.writeLine. How many times do you have to type using system? Or if you're using something like Writer, ReSharper, or Visual Studio, you do Control period or Alt Enter to handle those. Now you can do it in one way and have it be applicable throughout the project. So right now I can just add global using system to any of my C# files, and now system will automatically be used in the application. You can also do it statically too. So I hear you see me using global using static system.console. So now system.console will be available throughout my entire application. Here I'm doing global using and assigning an alias to it. I'm assigning the alias of env to system.environment. That allows you to use env instead of typing out the whole thing, or with env there's a lot of, or system.environment, there are a lot of different namespace collisions, so it still supports the aliasing of it. If you don't want to do it in a file, you can also do it in the csproj file. But before I move into that step to show you that, these global using statements can be anywhere within your application, any CS file. So you can, in theory, have one in like your program.cs, another one in startup, another one in class. There's no requirement for where it sits, although there is kind of a best practice to put them in something like a global using.cs or global.cs, so that people are aware and not just surprised, like, where did this randomly come from? If you're concerned with that and don't want to do a global using or global CS, you can also do it directly in the project file. So within the project file, you can add an item group using include equals system, and this provides you the same effect as doing global using system. Same thing like static, you can just add the attribute to that using statement, static equals true. For the aliases, as you can probably figure out, you add the attribute of alias equals env. Now this allows you to store it in the project level, so if you have your own project templates and want to use it all throughout your application or throughout multiple applications, that's an easy way to do it. Speaking of which, because there are some common include statements that happen in every project, Microsoft provides the ability now within your application to have implicit usings in your project file. What this does is this says, hey, based on your project type, I am going to include some basic ones. So the basic ones that are included depend on the project type. To do that, we add a project group called implicit usings and set the property to enable true, any Boolean kind of value. The standard is pretty much enable. To show you some examples, these are the project types that are supported. .NET SDK, SDK Web, SDK Worker, and then Windows Desktop, both for WinForms and WPF. So you're probably wondering, well, what is involved in that? What using statements are there? So let's take a look at that. The .NET SDK, these are the using statements that are in their system, system.collections.generic, IO, link, net, HTTP, threading, and threading tasks. These are, when you opt in for sharing analytics, Microsoft uses that, as well as a lot of open source projects to determine what are the most common libraries that are used in applications, and save you a couple steps. And here there's a link to see more on it. If you go to jjg.me/6_implicit, you can see more details on it. For the web, you'll notice some of the common ones in here: JSON, ASP.NET Core Builder, hosting, HTTP, routing, configuration, dependency injection, and more. If you're building a worker project or a console app, basically these are the four: extensions configuration, extensions DI, extensions hosting and logging. And for desktop, this one's a little bit different. So for Windows Forms, you get everything that was included in system.sdk, plus you get system.drawing and system.windows.forms. For WPF-based applications, it's everything in system.sdk minus the system.io and system.net. Again, if you're looking to use this, take a look at that link. It takes you directly to Microsoft documentation on it. Next feature, it's also semi-controversial Virtual is the file scope namespaces. So this allows you to add a namespace at the file level, basically removing the one set of indenting. So here it's making the assumption that this class is going to be part of the Joe Guadagno namespace. So if I look here and I reference, or I look at the compile code, you'll see Joe Guadagno dot file scope namespace dot main in this case. If you like this approach, there's also in the C# language features, I suggested a new feature to also have classes defined at the file level too. So you can do namespace, Joe Guadagno dot file scope, and then public static main separately. And it'll just assume everything's in that file scope namespace. There's some improvements to lambdas. Here you see in pre-C#10 on line 2, there's a function that's defined with a string and int, and it takes that string and returns the parse value of it in int. .NET 6, aka C#10, now it's smart enough to know that you want a func of string and int, and you can now declare it as var. And if you were to hover over parse in in Visual Studio Code, or JetBrains Writer, it'll automatically show you that it's a func. So that makes it pretty much a lot easier to handle now for lambdas, less verbose. One of the trends you'll notice with a lot of the C#10 improvements is that Microsoft was trying to reduce the number of keystrokes across the board for you. Here's another example with functions and actions. So here, the console read, you can automatically infer, as we'll see on the next slide, that it's going to be a var that will be an int. However, line 3 is not going to work, as we're saying an action string. We're going to call console.write. And the reason why it doesn't work is because, as you see on line 6, that one will fail to compile. And that's because console.write has multiple overloads that can return different values. So .NET, or aka the compiler, is not able to figure out what that variable type is. So in that particular case, you're going to have to go with the old school, which is line 3 of action string. Some other improvements. There's been improvements to struct starting in C#10. You can include your own parameterless, that's a really hard word to say, struct constructors. If you don't supply one, there's one that's automatically figured out for you. The interpolated, another really hard word to say, string improvements. There's a whole blog post by Steve Toga, something like 27 pages, that talks about the string improvements. Basically, in a nutshell, they changed the way that memory is allocated with strings, and they do more interpretation of the overall string with your curly braces in it, and allocate memory differently, as opposed to doing it each time there was an individual string that you wanted to insert. You also have the ability to override how strings are handled. If you want to treat it slightly differently, you can override that now, where before you couldn't. It's a lot more available. If you go to https://jjg.me/6_c10, you'll see more features on it. Let's talk about some of the changes in ASP.NET now. ASP.NET has it. Oh, I forgot. Let's see. I'm looking at the questions. Let me go to the questions for a second. Does .NET 6 core still run on a runtime for the platform using intermediate code? I believe so. Jeff, and your second question, does that mean for any of those project types you don't have to explicitly? Yes. If you infer the project types, the usings is automatically there. You don't have to put them in on any file. So let's look at some of these features of ASP.NET. So minimal APIs is all the rage right now. This is a simple minimal API. If you ever want to build a website that just returns the word hello world, this is awesome for it. But in all honesty, there's a lot more to minimal APIs. In this actual case, you can get rid of the line number 2. It automatically assumes that if you don't build it, when you run the app, it automatically builds it. So you actually don't even need that anymore. But minimal APIs is intended for specific use cases. The more experienced developer that maybe wants to return just a file or return smaller sets of JSONs. If you're building a basic CRUD app, you can still and probably still use the older MVC model for it. You can also mix and match them. So what a lot of people are starting to do now is have your basic MVC controller for, reads, writes, updates, etc., but also using the minimal APIs for things like health checks, statuses, or one-off things that really kind of don't fit in there. Some other improvements. There's improvements to single R, which added a new HTTP activity filter, which allows you to be able to tie into monitoring applications, things like application insights, etc. There's also some performance improvements made to the hub caller client. Basically, it now has a singleton connection method for your hub now and doesn't create a new one for each individual method. From a Razor standpoint, there are improvements in there. Basically, you have Razor does not Razor does not produce a separate views assembly. Right now, there's just one assembly for your app, which includes the views, business knowledge, etc. Hot Reload is also in there, supporting Visual Studio 2022, the .NET command line. It's available for both C# and Visual Basic, not available for others. There's also ability for or support for HTTP 3. It's very minimal support right now, but you can interact with HTTP 3 clients and servers right now. There's improved support for SPA applications. A lot of the templates were updated. The web templates have been also updated for Angular 2 version 12. Let's take a look at some of the Windows Forms improvements. The accessibility has been improved tremendously within Windows Forms. Now you have these UIA providers, which stand for User Interface Automation Providers. Now there's basically allows you to add in accessibility commands and text for checklist box, link labels, panels, scroll bars, tab, and track bars now. So when there are screen readers or other devices to help read a screen, you now can add more text to them. This works well with, or works for, Windows Form. The other thing that's also added is the ability now to set up a default font. So in the past, your applications, when they're Windows Forms apps, used whatever the system default was. And if you wanted to change that, you had to update every form, every label, every component on your Win form to that font. Now you just, in the startup of your application, you can set the set default font to whatever font you want. Your entire application would use that. So this is your great opportunity for you that are comedians like me to set your application to use the Comic Sans Serif font all throughout. Also, like there are minimal APIs, there's now the ability for minimal apps within Windows Forms. So you'll see on line 6, there's an application configuration initialize. Behind the scenes, the runtime is calling the application.enable visual styles, set compatible text rendering, set default font, set high DPI mode. Those basically 5 things. So they're getting rid of all that crap for you and giving you the ability. In all honesty, in line 3, you can actually get rid of the apartment threading attribute, which is on line 3. That's not needed. It's in the default template because Microsoft did not want people to get all freaked out when they didn't see that there. By default, it's automatically included for Windows Forms applications. Some other updates. There's been a lot of template updates, which include the new application bootstrap, which was that template I showed you on the previous slide. It's global using directives now, file scope namespaces, as well as nullable reference types. There's more designers. Pretty much every component now within WinForms has a designer to it. You don't have to, manually hard code stuff anymore. It's also support for single page applications, or not single page, sorry, single file applications. You now have the ability to just distribute one exe. Essentially, MS Build will put all the dependencies inside that application. It might make for a very large application, but it's one application to start with. Right now, you have to enable this, or this is enabled now for Windows and Mac. Previously, it was only available for Linux. Now it's available for all. You can read more in other Windows Forms improvements at 6_WinForms. Some performance improvements. If you've been following anything with .NET over the last 3 years or so, Microsoft has made a huge effort on improving the performance for .NET altogether. .NET 6 is no exception, and if anything, performance was a real big push for this release. We're going to talk about some of the file I/O differences. You'll see a little bit more at 6_file I/O, but basically they rewrote the file stream object. With the file stream object, you'll notice, or not you'll notice, but on Windows, some of the changes had a dramatic improvement. Let's take a look at some of those improvements. In the SDK, there is a test project. In the test project, they have a method where they're writing out a 100 meg file asynchronously. In .NET, that file on average took about 1 second or so to write and allocated almost 4K of memory. In .NET 6, that went down to 308 milliseconds, so basically a third of a second, and used almost 1,000 times less memory of 3K memory. So that's a 1,200% of allocation memory and around the 20% or 25-ish% drop in it. And you'll see that theme throughout the SDK. Also added the ability for JSON or System.Text.Json source generators. Now this one I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the next slide, but to show you a little bit about the serialization. So here, on average, the time for basic serialization in their test cases was 243 nanoseconds, and this is using System.Reflection to figure it out. With source gen serialization now, it's down to 149 nanoseconds, which doesn't sound like that it's that much of a difference because we're talking nanoseconds at this point. But when you start thinking about, you're pulling in a JSON file with, thousands or hundreds of thousands of records, that time adds up a bit. So let's talk about some of the new APIs. JSON serialization is probably the biggest change that's happened. We added the ability for, with C# source generators, the ability to use source generators to generate the text that, or generate the instructions that the framework uses to serialize. In the past, if you had this internal class of person with a first name and last name property, when you try to deserialize that or serialize it, the .NET SDK would use the system.reflection to look at the object, look at the properties, look at the types, then write it out. And if you've ever done anything with system.reflection, you know that can be a very time-consuming effort. There's a lot of work that goes into reflecting through the whole assembly. Well, now Microsoft added the ability to serialize JSON a little bit easier. So in order to do that, you reference the System.Text.Json serialization, and then you use this attribute JSON serializable, and you tell it the type of object. So based on the last slide, we're going to serialize a person object, and then you create this internal partial class of whatever you want to call it. Here I just called it my JSON context, but most likely you'll call it person context. And it inherits or implements the JSON serialization context. What ends up happening behind the scenes, the reason why it's partial is because behind the scenes, these are what's generated for you. So it generates a it generates a method called default or property that can return the basics of that. So in this case, it will return what you want for the default. Since this is a person object, it's going to return a null. But you can override that and return what you want that default to be. So if it's just file new, you can set that to automatically initialize the person, initialize the first name, last name. There's also a JSON type info for person. So this provides all the details of the person class in a JSON way, or not necessarily in a JSON way, but the attributes required for JSON. So whether it's string, whether it's date, time, etc., and the formatting for it. And that's what's used by the serializer to output or read that. There's also a method to allow you to change the serialization by default. So if you want to do all lowercase or camel case or allow null values, etc., you can override all those or pass in your overridden defaults. If you're going to use a serializer, I'll show more in the next slide. You're going to want to look at the JSON serializer options because the JSON serializer options vary depending on the project type. So if you're doing a console application, there's one set of defaults. If you're building a web API or a web application, the JSON serializer has a different set of defaults. And then the last method is get type info, which is going to give you more details around the type from a .NET standpoint. So if we want to use this, let's say lines 1 and 2, and it's only 2 lines just to save space on the slide. Here I'm creating an instance of a new person, first name Joe, last name Guadagno. If I was to serialize this, you see lines 3 and 4. I am creating calling the JSON serializer .serialize to UTF-8 bytes. The version of the serializer you call could vary. I tend to use the UTF-8 because that's the best encoding. Pass it in the person that was done on line 1, and then say you're going to use the default person serialization that I defined in the previous class here. And then if you want to deserialize it on line 5 and 6, more so line 6, you see I'm passing in the results of line 3. You know, in a real world, you wouldn't do that, but that's your string or list of bytes, and then saying, I want you to use this context to deserialize everything. It ends up, I don't have the numbers on the slides. If you go to this URL below, you'll see some of the numbers, but there's roughly 1.5 to 2 times performance increase by doing that. So if you're doing a lot of reading and writing for SDKs, your best bet is to create your own serializer context, or at least inherit the one that's there. There's better memory performance, better serialization throughput, reduced amount of memory. It's just a far better way of doing it. I've already started in a lot of my personal projects updating the serialization altogether. I've added a couple new APIs for the WebSocket compression, which is also a community contribution. One of the awesome benefits of having .NET be open source is that the community has now got involved with doing it. Another community contribution was the SOX proxy support. Another cool feature, this one I really like, the System.Extension hosting now has the ability to configure the host options right away. In the past, you'd have to create a new builder. That new builder would then have a property called configure host. You would then have to create an instance of that here. Now there's an extension method that allows you to configure any of the default hosting options. To me, this reads a little bit clearer. Here I'm setting the shutdown time out to 10 minutes. There's also new ability or new feature for automatic compile time source generator. This one's a little bit hard to grasp, just based on text. So I'm going to show you one of the examples for it. So here on the third line, we have logger message event ID 0, logger level log critical, message equals could not save user with the interpolated string. So what ends up happening now is with this, whenever when the method could not save user is called, it's automatically going to create a logger using the iLogger implementation of it with the level of critical event ID 0 and message 0. So this text is automatically going to be built in and allows you to have a clearer code. So your code example, or the code that would be in this partial method or could not save user method, would be just the actual business logic. It would automatically do the logging when the method is called. There's also ways to do it for when the method exits. And again, you can look at the URL for the previous slide for more information. System.Ling had a lot of improvements too. You'll see that there is now enumeration support for index ranges. This allows you to only iterate or enum through certain parts, or enumerate through certain parts. Like I'd say, just give me the first 10 records, or give me the next 10 records. This one's a very hard one to say. Try get non-enumerated count. Basically, this will go through and try to get the count of the number of items in a enumerable list without enumerating through the list. For most cases, this works fairly well, but if you have large lists, it could take a minute or two. The distinct by, union by, intercept by, and accept by now have new key selector functions. So in the past, you would have to create a separate function that would return results. Now you can do something to the effect of, x to x dot first name. So if I want to give a distinct by first name, you can now just call the property of a method. Same thing with union by, intercept by, and accept by. That also works with max and min by. Also, you can specify, like, I want the max age of user dot age, and it will do that for you without the need to create the function. Chunk was a community contribution. So if you have large enumerable lists, let's say you're getting a list of all the clients you have, and there's 1,000, but you only want to iterate through 100 at a time, you can chunk it by hundreds, and you'll get a for each loop of just the first 100, and you can do it again for the next 100, etc. First or default, last or default, single or default are now community contributions that allows you to overload what's there. So instead of just first or default returning whatever the default is for the data type you're using, you can now specify what the default is. Let's say you're doing, select the oldest person in a group and there's no one in the group, by default that would return 0 for you. Maybe you wanted to return a null or a negative number. You have the ability to override those now. There's also zip, which is another community contribution item that allows you to compress enumerations. There's priority queues, which is another community contribution. This one is basically a new collection type that allows you to set the ordering in which you want items in this queue. So you have your typical queues are first in, first out, last in, last out. Priority queue allows you to assign an attribute that indicates how it should be. So let's say you have 3 tiers of clients, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. You can use the tier property as priority. So when you're working on messages from the queue, you grab all the tier 1s first, then go to the tier 2s, then go to tier 3s without having to do any of your own custom sorting on that. Some other enhancements, there's been some changes to Roslyn and the CLI. Right now, there's one of the biggest changes is the ability to restore, install, list, or update workloads. So in the past, you had to run the .NET installer, select which workloads you wanted, like ASP.NET, mobile development, etc. But as we know, there's lots of people that like UIs, but probably even more people nowadays that don't like user interfaces. So with the CLI, you have the ability to restore, install, or list, or update any of those from a command line. One of my favorite changes in here is the now SDK check. So if you do .NET SDK check, you see on the screen, there is a list of, this is a screenshot from my desktop. You see I have, at the time of creating this slide deck, I had like 12-ish or so versions of .NET SDK, which you had the ability before, but the difference is now you get more messaging around. So you see I have in the first one .NET 3.1, 4.10, and the library is telling me, hey, you have a patch available for this. So the versions of .NET 5, which apparently have 6 different versions on, I'm getting a message saying it's going out of support soon. And for my .NET 6.0s, I have messaging saying that there's a patch available. Then it looks at the runtime, and apparently I have a lot of runtimes on my machine. I see I have a bunch of 2.1s that are out of support. I have 3.1s that have a patch available. I have a bunch of 5.0s that are available or going out of support, and 6.0s. So this is something that's kind of cool to run every once in a while, especially if you're doing a lot of different versions like I tend to do. There's also new command line .NET new. I don't think that's really new, but the new parameters to it is search. This allows you to search through the NuGet repository or any registered repository you have for certain templates. So if you're doing something like Uno, which is not installed by default, you can do .NET new search for Uno, and it will come back with a list of all the templates that use the Uno platform. There's their interactive mode now. So if you have your own custom NuGet repository where you store your own templates, or let's say you have a firewall or a proxy server in your organization that requires you to log in, the interactive will allow you to do that, provide any prompts or anything that happens with that. There's also the update check and update apply, which will do those. Update check will check to see if there's any templates that you have in your machine that have updates available. The apply allows you to apply any of those updates. There's been some changes to Roslyn. I'm not going to go and cover them all. You can see more at 6_Roslyn. But basically 16 analyzers were added, and 6 of them were from the community. So as you see, there's a general theme across the board that Microsoft is, with .NET being open source, now they're even more so than before. There's a lot more community contributions. So I think it's important that we kind of wrap it up with some of the support policies so you understand with .NET 6 coming out, what does that mean for your .NET Framework apps, .NET Core 3, 4, and 5 apps. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit. So based on the time I wrote this slide deck, this is the varying support. So .NET 6, the original release date was November 28th. The latest patch, again, as of the writing of this, was 6.0. It's on the LTS support, which is long-term support. That means it's going to be supported for 3 years. So I'll cover some more of that on the next slide. The end of support for this is 3 years, so the 24th. .NET 5 is in the current support phase, but it's scheduled to be phased out in the next 2 months. .NET 3.0 is ending its long-term support phase. So December of this year, that will no longer be supported. What that means basically is that the application, your applications should be updated, because if there's security patches and stuff, they're not going to be, they might not be covered. So let's take a look at the release cadence with that. So basically, long-term support is happening with the exception of .NET 3.1 for every even numbered release. So .NET 6 was the first even numbered release that was released on November of 2021. So that means for the next 3 years till November 2024, they're going to be releasing patches, etc. for that. Once it hits November 2024, nothing's going to be done. Which means .NET 5 that was released prior to is listed as current. So they're basically going to support patching for 18 months. .NET 7, which is an intern release, even though it's a major release, is going to have 18-month support. And by the time .NET 8 comes out, you'll have 3 years support for it, so till 2026. But you'll notice the trend, .NET or Microsoft committed to delivering a new release of .NET every year, and then the support cadence is clear now, so you know when you're moving to a version what that means as far as your support is concerned. That being said, I am out of content, so we're going to open it up to questions. If you want to reach out to me, here are some of the ways you can do it: Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, my website, where you'll see a lot of articles like around C#10, .NET, and other things, as well as my stream, which I tend to not stream as much anymore because I've just gotten way too busy with it. Take a look at the chats to see if there's any items up there. Mark looked like he has his hand up. You want to type it in chat, Mark?
Oh, okay, no problem.
Or talk?
I could talk if that's okay.
Yeah.
So I still am using the Newtonsoft.Json. I find that it's familiar, and there were some features originally with the Microsoft implementation that just didn't work properly. So I've stuck with it. Is there a lot performance increase compared to the Newtonsoft.Json serialization, deserialization?
Yes and no. There's actually a very, very lengthy guide. If you go to docs.microsoft.com or just search for Newtonsoft versus System.Text.Json, Microsoft put together a very long article about the differences and some of the performance differences between the two. Side note, if you don't know this, but what's his name? James Newton, who wrote Newtonsoft, now works for Microsoft and has been spending most of his time on the System.Text.Json implementation of it. So while Newtonsoft is still there because more than half of the world's .NET stuff is built on it, I don't know how much support there will be for it going forward, but Microsoft has provided a pretty decent guide for how to migrate off of it and the pros and cons of both of them.
I didn't realize they had hired them. Thank you.
Yes, about 2 years ago, actually.
Well,
I don't see any other hands raised. That's not it. Sorry for being late. Thank you all for attending, and I'm sure there'll be links to, if you go to my site, jjg.me about JJG, you'll see in the presentation section, you can download the slides there that also have additional notes in there if you need. That being said, thank you for taking time, especially during lunch for those of you on the East Coast. Have an awesome day.